the adults were expanded versions of the youth, and the youth in those days were just minifigures of the fathers and mothers. But they weren't different to them, and they didn't want to be different. An interesting thing now is the accent of Gonzaga boys now, quite different. You get a real dub now, whereas before they all had cut-class accents.
What's a cut-class accent?
Well, you might think of the Oxford accent par excellence.
Okay.
And the parents too tended to have the same sort of accent, and the children picked it up from the parents. But I don't think there's much picking up of accents from parents nowadays. That's my general impression. So there was a big difference in that. That was beginning, it was only just beginning in 1961. It changed radically as it went on.
So what you went on to say, you said that in this speech, you said, there were small boys in blazers, short pants and school caps walked up from the courtyard in single file, in silence to the first class, and at break knelt on the lunchroom floor for the rosary under Father Laheen's commanding eye. The senior boys were squashed versions of their parents. The adolescent culture was yet to emerge.
That's right.
So something happened then, or a million things happened then, but what do you think caused that change? I know it's something people talk about all the time, so maybe it's hard to do this without talking in cliches. What's your sense of what the hell happened at the end of the 50s and at the start of the 60s?
Well, I think it was a generation that had become weary, and there was a terrific turmoil in the Second World War, and that jolted people. And I think it jolted people out of their complacency and out of their normal way of thinking. And that was an element in it, very definitely, the jolt of the Second World War. And everything was thrown up for grabs.
So I remember the late Michael Paul Gallagher once talked, he said, we used to live in a culture of authority and now we live in a culture of experience, where people have to experience something for themselves to accept it or to feel it's worth embracing, whereas before they just took what their parents, teachers, authorities told them.
And now in that stage they were beginning to take it, if the parents have that idea, it must be wrong. Whereas before it must be correct.
You're very positive, and I think you have continued to be as time has gone on, but about the product of education produced in Gonzaga. So another quote from you: it saw the purpose of education in the educational activity itself, which developed skills and attitudes that had value in themselves, independent of their utility.
Yes, I think that was the kernel of the Gonzaga ideal.
So can you distinguish here between value and utility?
Well, the utility, if it got you into the university, it was a good value, as it were. What was useful rather than what was good in itself and fine in itself. I think that was it.
So the activity, so in other words, it's not so much what they learn, but I suppose the character they become, the temperament, the men they're becoming, isn't it? Rather than the subjects they're mastering.
Oh yes.
Is it more that?
Well, I think that puts it extremely well. That's not just what we learned in school was not just to enable us to do well and get a good career, but there was good value in it independently of that. Charles Lycett would be an apostle of that.
What about you? When you were in Gonzaga, Joe Veale was someone who's often associated with developing the philosophy or ethos of Gonzaga. What could you give us some reflections on Joe Veale's place in the history of Gonzaga?
He was a great upholder of education for its own sake, Now that there's no question. And he would pour scorn on anyone that would say that the value of education lay in its usefulness, in the sense of practical usefulness that got you a good job. It was enabling you to do better work, perhaps. No, he would say, it was what it did to yourself. And in that way, he expressed that more cogently than most. Though many of the other priests and members of staff, like the John Wilson, would have been very strong on the same notion.
Yeah, I might be kind of labouring the same point, but I want to just keep going on the education thing. So again, I'm quoting your speech. You said, excellent though Gonzaga's educational philosophy was, it was narrow. It gave limited scope to science, and initiation into science is a central element of a liberal education.
Yes.
Over the years, it has broadened the curriculum to something approaching the liberal model, increasing the role of art and music, greatly enhancing the role of the sciences, retaining the classical languages, and resisting almost the pressure to introduce non-liberal subjects such as business studies.
That's right.
So, could you just elaborate on that word liberal, which came up a couple of times? What's the definition of that word in this context?
Well, in this context, it meant an education that was liberal rather than utilitarian. It wasn't there simply because of what it attained externally. Like a doctor could be very liberal, but he could also be very utilitarian in his attitude towards education. Mm. And when all came down to all, you have to have a bit of utility in the education or it'll be scorned. And I think Gonzaga didn't go on an extreme course.
So I'm going to ask you about some students in particular. So we've already mentioned Sutherland, and you kind of touched on something a few minutes ago about Sutherland. So during for the homily for his funeral, you said his enthusiasm for the real benefits of globalisation may indeed have blurred his view of its downside, but he rightly emphasised its benefit to poorer countries of the world. So can you talk a bit more about Sutherland?
Yes.
And then, if you don't mind, we don't need to go there, but immigration is a hot topic in Ireland, as you know.
Oh, yes.
So I wonder if you might be able to give some sort of a nuanced perspective on what you see in Ireland today, because it is more present as an issue than it was, say, 10 or 20 years ago.
Oh, yes.
Or 50 years ago, obviously, you know. And Sutherland might be seen as a kind of a symbol, obviously, of globalisation, which is linked to immigration. So can you talk a bit about all of that?
All of it, okay. Take a nibble here and there. Well, Sutherland was a globalist. I think his biography is called The Globalist.
That's right.
And that's true. And I think he saw the benefits of globalisation. He wasn't so keen on the negative side of globalisation. And the globalisation that he didn't approve of was coming close to the immigration issue. He didn't believe that the culture should be swamped by an alien culture. Now, I haven't given a great deal of thought to that, but there's something in it. If you read, the book, I've read it umpteen times, by, he wrote How Europe Lost Itself, and secondly...
Douglas Murray?
Not Murray, nobody that maybe of that. Douglas Murray.
Douglas Murray?
I think so.
He's a young guy, Englishman.
Yes.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. The death of Europe.
The Death of Europe.
The Strange Death of Europe, I think.
And The Strange Death of Europe, but that later book was more interesting.
The Madness of Crowds.
The Madness of Crowd, that's it. But I'm losing it if I'm forgetting books I became violently enthusiastic about. But Sutherland never answered his questions. Because Sutherland basically was a doer rather than a thinker. He used thought, obviously, and he thought well, but he wasn't a theoretician. He was all for changing things or getting things done better in that way. And he saw globalisation attaining a great deal for poorer countries. And he was all for that. And he was all for the values of democracy. Now, immigration today, in one sense, it brings out a certain selfishness in people. Not in my own backyard, let other people have immigration by the millions, but not here. But I think there is something about it being managed properly. You see, the states have made an awful mess of things insofar as destroyed the communitarian aspect of the states I see because it wasn't managed well. Because I'm all for legal immigration, and I know lots of people in the States who went down the legal immigration area way, and it cost them a good deal to do that. But now they're quite put out when they see people getting special privilege for what? For defying the law and getting privileges for being illegal immigrants. And when they would say they're being sponsored by one of the two political parties. Now, if that's true or not is another matter, of course. But Peter, in many ways, he was a man of his age, and he represented the positive side of his age, of generosity, liberality. He was a great man for saying that he was a liberal, and that I think he more or less described his father at the father's funeral as being an unconscious liberal. So I don't think I've answered that very well.
No, you've given us a few nuggets for sure. More recently in Ireland, we've had the return of Michael McDowell. Do you remember him as a student? Or
very well.
So what are your memories of him?
I remember first of all as a young lad in Prep 3 in the primary school, a sweet little boy, very timid, and all the rest of it. He'd be a great person to talk to the scholastic at lunchtime.
And pick the brains of the scholastic, or?
Well, he wouldn't feel anywhere at a loss being with the scholastic, and some might have seen him as a suck-up, but he changed. I believe by the time he was in sixth year, he's quite different, much more combative, and that came out in the debating society, and he chewed people up. I believe I had already moved on. I was watching it from a distance from Milltown, and I helped out in the rugby, I think, but Michael had given up all rugby.
I think you used the word formidable in one description of him.
Formidable as a sixth year he was. He became formidable, but as a youngster in the prep school he wasn't. His brother was, who became a doctor, Michael. What was his brother's name? But anyway, he became a doctor. I always remember him, one inconsequential remark. We used to have rugby practice over the Christmas holidays, and we had a reasonably good team that year, but it didn't mean that they arrived in time for rugby practice. And Michael McDowell, the brother, said to the group out with him, we're late, Barber will be roaring mad.
And were you angry, dear?
I wasn't particularly angry, but I could put on an act if I wanted to.
Yeah.
But and then he got down and he took it quite seriously. And Anthony Ensor was on that team who played for Ireland later. And then a couple of other interprovincials played. who became interventions on that team. And we drew with, this is going off the point, but we drew with St. Mary's. And I remember coming in afterwards, and St. Mary's, one fellow was asking, how the hell did we allow that happen? So my feeling was, we've got away with a draw with Mary's. The next thing could be tough. We beat them in the replay, and that put us in, I think, into the quarterfinals. And we just were narrowly beaten by Castleknock, who were very good that year. And one of the correspondents in the paper said, it was a pity this match wasn't the final. The quality of the rugby was worth the final. So that made us all very happy. But then I think Gonzaga went back into the shadows.
And then they returned, obviously, in the last few years.
Oh, yes.
In a different way. Do you remember Anthony Clare as a student?
I do, yes.
What do you remember of him?
I remember him as being a really formidable debater, very friendly, very keen to help in Gonzaga in whatever way. Very, very nice man. Now, other people mightn't have found him so nice, but I found him delightful. And he was very helpful. I was editor of studies, and he was very, very helpful in that regard.
This was when he was an adult, grown man?
When he was a grown man, yes.
Right.
As a boy, I didn't know him at all. He had left by the time I came in 1961. But he was a great friend of the Father Eddie Keane and Eddie Keane's family. And that was saying a lot for him and for the Keanes. Father Eddie Keane was one of those very brilliant fellows, but he hadn't the aura of Joe Veale. So I think he was smarter than Joe. But I said somewhere, but no one could match his high seriousness. He expressed views that Eddie Keane wouldn't express. But he'd lived them out. And so would Joe, of course. But Eddie Keane was one of those very, very bright fellows.
Another titan of Gonzaga was Father Joe Brennan.
Oh, yes.
So you remember him when he was in school?
I do indeed.
So not many people could say that.
I was in first year and he was in sixth year, and he was a type of god to us. He was captain of the school, and I think he was vice captain of rugby. He was a star in the opera, and he played on the Leinster rugby team. So he was really the star of that year, and the nicest of fellows. It was pedantic in certain ways, but really true gold. And I don't think he'd ever have an enemy as a schoolboy. He was really much loved by everyone. And I often thought it was ironic in the opera that year where he did very, very well. He was a horrid creature called Shadbolt, the very antithesis to Joe Brennan in real life.
That was his shadow.
Exactly, absolutely. Then he went into university and he did history. And generally, for some reason, they didn't have a high opinion of him. But he got first. He left all the others who did very distinguished careers in history and in journalism and in radio and all the rest. But Joe got first. And he didn't go in academically in history. And I think it was really that Joe wasn't top class academic, stuck to him.
Say that again.
He went I think the reputation that, Joe isn't a real academic, he's a decent fellow. I think that image stuck.
Even though he was top of the class?
Even though he was top of the class and beat people who became professors of history and became leading journalists, and one of them a Chief Justice.
And what do you think was the legacy of his career? Is there a better way to put that career, but his time working and serving? What's the main thing that came of that?
Well, I think that, again, he was considered a solid fellow. He'd be a good teacher. He'd take no nonsense and he'd be very kind to everyone. But they never emphasized his academic achievements.
So he was very humble.
Oh, very, absolutely. Absolutely. And he could be exasperating, that's true, by being almost too good. But I didn't realize when I knew him in the society first that he had such an illustrious career in the university. I just took it for granted. Joe Brennan is a decent fellow.
He was an excellent musician as well.
Oh, excellent. I mean, he was almost concert standard. Oh, yes. But somewhere or other, he never really was revered for that aspect of his career or his character and temperament and ability. It was a shame.
Do you remember Eamon Ryan as a student?
I do. He had just left when I arrived.
Okay.
His brother was in sixth year, Robert.
Who became a doctor, isn't that right?
That's right.
And so you don't have much memory of Eamon?
No, except as a very friendly man. Like, he would stop me in the street, which says a lot for a person. And very, very friendly and helpful in every way. I know my sister and my brother and my nephew don't think much of him, and it annoys me intensely. Now, they can't stand Jim O'Callaghan either.
Right.
And even my saying of Jim O'Callaghan that he's very brilliant, but very lazy. And the same in rugby. That doesn't even satisfy them.
So
they got a scholarship to Cambridge, and then got a scholarship in Cambridge.
So what would O'Callaghan say to that? Does he agree with your verdict?
Oh, I'm sure that he does not. He's also a good fellow if you ask him to do anything. And he'll do it. I got him to do something for our lady who looks after our refectory, the Chinese lady, and he jolly well did it. And that's something.
Can you tell the story of the Caravaggio on Leeson Street?
Oh, sure.
In Leeson Street. You, maybe falsely, Lycett speaks very highly of you, or is he accurate to give you credit for that happening?
Well, they do, and I think it's a little excessive, because what I decided was I was doing up the house, and we had a painting which I believe was by Honthorst. And Honthorst, I believed, was at the top of the second division, championship, fighting to get into the first division. So I said, if I'm having the walls painted, and I should certainly have this painting, which was worth a few million anyway. And I shouldn't neglect that for its own intrinsic value. And then I went to the assistant director of the National Gallery and asked, would he have any advice? But he said, we're obliged to look after paintings in private ownership if they are of outstanding quality, because they are part of our remit. So he said, if that is a Honthorst, certainly that should be restored. Because on the painting itself was not Honthorst, or it was his nickname, Gerardo della Notte, Gerard of the Night. But it was the grammar was incorrect. It should be Notte, and it's Notte. And that was commented upon. So people were looking out for a painting. But I didn't know that. And anyone I spoke to didn't know that. I came across it in some book when we were well down the road, discovering that it was a Caravaggio, and I didn't want to queer the pitch.
You weren't what?
I didn't want to queer the pitch.
Yes.
So he said, we'll get Benedetti, who is the curator of Italian paintings and who's very well up in Caravaggio and that era. And so he came down and he looked at it, and so did the assistant director. And then we went in, I said, we'll stay for a glass of wine or something. So they opted for sherry. And I always think of that as toasting the discovery of Caravaggio, because Benedetti said later, he said, when I saw it, my thing was, God, that's the best version of the missing Caravaggio, and good God, could it be the missing Caravaggio? So he said, we will certainly look after that. So they took it away and began the study, which established that it was a Caravaggio. They established it was original, the date was correct, his date, and that it had all the marks of a Caravaggio which he had worked on, like there were changes in it, and that, so it wasn't a fellow coming along seeing a Caravaggio and then copying it. So then one day, the rector came and said, could I see you this morning? I'll be going past your door. I was in Leeson Street at the time. Well, I said, sure. So he came in, I got up to welcome him. He said, sit down. You can't take what I'm going to tell you standing up. So he said, it's not by Honthorst. So I said, well, now this is really going to be bad news. He says, by Caravaggio. But I knew enough about painting to add on, put it vulgarly, to add on a few noughts onto its value. So much for liberal education. So then he said, but there's certain things has to be done before we can make an announcement. One, he said, Sir Dennis Mann must say it's a Caravaggio. He was of the Guinness family, who had nothing to do in his life. He had born a millionaire, and he spent his life on art. And he was an expert on, and he's left a lot to the National Gallery here. He said he is the expert on Caravaggio, and if he says it's not Caravaggio, that's the end of it. No one will believe it's a Caravaggio, no matter what evidence is produced. So he said we'll get him to say a few words. So they had some occasion and they invited him to it, and they asked him, we've got something to show you here, said Dennis. Who painted that painting? In 5 seconds, said Caravaggio, of course. So that, whew. So, and he said to me when I handed over the painting on behalf of the Society to the National Gallery on indefinite loan, and he showed me around the various copies and ones that had put the name forward, and the one that had put the name forward most definitely was Odessa, which we heard a bit about these days in the war, in the Crimea. But he said, you see that painter who did the Odessa, he's a magnificent painter, but he has a great weakness, one weakness, which was a Caravaggio's strength. Look at his fingers. So I looked all right to me. And he said, those fingers are like sausages. And he said, that writes him off. But he was very loud in his praise, except at one point, which was a great help to him. So that's roughly. But one interesting thing was when we were told that I could allow the community know, of course, but we weren't to speak about it, and we imposed on ourselves a vow of Trappist silence, and we didn't even speak casually to one another about it until the news broke. And the news broke in a very interesting way. A very cunning journalist phoned up lots of people whom he thought might know something about it, and just saying, about this Caravaggio, that was a great idea of yours. So most of them said, what are you talking about? Except when he got on to Benedetti, he started stumbling and hooing an eye, and he said, he's the man, it's the National Gallery.
So if that hadn't happened, would it have remained a secret?
Oh no, it would have come out. Because you couldn't, I mean, what were we to do with it? When they asked, how did it get to you? It came to us, a Mattei family had the original, they had it, they got doing broke, and they sold off all their stuff to a Nesbitt family for a knockdown price, because a lady called Lee Wilson came along and bought it for 8 guineas. It was part of a job lot. And then she was married to a British Army officer who was home on sick leave from the trenches and given something to do. He was put in charge of the prisoners in 1916 in the having been taken from the GPO on the way to the prison, he humiliated them. One man in particular, Clark. And in the film on De Valera, there's a scene of that being done, and Michael Collins going out to box this fella, and De Valera, leave it there, Michael, we'll get him in time, but don't do anything rash. So they murdered him. And this got on Mrs. Lee Wilson's mind, and it kind of discombobulated her completely. And she went to Father Finlay, in other words, an in-law of the lady we saw going in there, and he was a great confidant of hers. And as a sign of how much she owed him, she must have arrived one day with a truck and present the painting to Leeson Street as a gift to the community, recognising how good Father Finlay was.
So it was gifted to the Jesuits?
Gifted to the Jesuits. And fortunately there was no one contesting the gifting. So then what were we to do with it? Well, I said something which I had no authority whatsoever to say. I said to the Deputy Director of the National Gallery, I said, of course, the place for this painting is the National Gallery. So he probably wrote that down several times, that Barber said to me. And of course, I had no authority, but that didn't matter. A Jesuit said it, and a Jesuit who was responsible for the painting said it. So it couldn't be taken back. Well, I was delighted it couldn't be taken back. So that's roughly the story.
Well, thank you for recounting that. I'm sure you've been asked about that a lot.
A fair amount.
So I'm reading from Men Speechless here, and this is Father Joe Veale. The Jesuits were successful educators because they took one thing at a time. They had one clear aim, and everything was subordinated to it and determined by it. So what was that aim to which everything was subordinated?
His thing was definitely rhetoric. Men Speechless was his central educational philosophy, and everything was subordinated to that. Which didn't please mathematicians greatly, nor classicists. And there was always a bit of tension in the community because of that. And so he'd be prickly about anyone questioning him. And there were people that were able to question him. Father Lee, Father Keane, for example, one mathematician, one a classicist. And they weren't particularly chuffed by having their subject. He had some very derogatory description of mathematicians. What was it? Numbers. I think that there were number people. So that caused a certain amount of tension within the community. But that's what he means by this would be the central theme: men speechless, men speechful.
To bring this up to a sort of a current phenomenon, I want to mention something here and then see if you can reflect on it in light of what has happened since.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so one thing he mentions is, it is no great harm if they learn incidentally to be dubious of the infallibility of the popular press or the more dogmatic pundits in the Sunday reviews. And then later on he says, there is good reason to think that radio and TV will once more restore the ascendancy of the spoken word. So he's talking about two different things there, but initially the students picking holes in the infallibility of the press. And the reason I bring that up is obviously today I think there's more doubt about the press and the media than there maybe ever has been.
That's right.
And then to just say that last line again, there is good reason to think that radio and TV will once more restore the ascendancy of the spoken word. I think it's fair to say that hasn't happened.
No, I think it's very fair.
So Do you have any reflections on media and your experience of that and your consumption of that?
Well, my view on that, insofar as the value, is that there's a tendency of newspapers and the media being partisan, whereas we'll do the thinking for you. That's one way of putting it. Like if you take the Guardian and the Daily Telegraph, they are mirror images of one another. They're absolutely partisan. And it annoys me intensely, though I try to conceal it, that we have become Guardian subscribers. I don't mind becoming a Guardian subscriber, provided there's another subscription as well. For instance, the Wall Street Journal is less partisan than the New York Times or the Guardian, which mirrors New York Times to the letter. But I think that the world has become more polarized, and therefore there's greater temptation of papers and of the media to become partisan of their side. And I heard someone analysing this, saying that why is the New York Times so unbalanced in its coverage? Because the readers of the New York Times want them that way. So to a certain extent, they're giving the people what they want.
Yes.
And why are people in the Telegraph getting all that stuff? Because the readers want it.
I suppose you're still trying to pull out what you can. You haven't given up on the whole enterprise entirely.
I don't think so, no. But pretty close to.
Yeah. One thing I experienced in America was the vast amount of discussion about the church, and sometimes it can get angry and all that, church politics or whatever. Do you keep an eye on any of that stuff as well?
I do.
And what are your kind of, who do you find interesting with regard to church things or spiritual life or whatever?
Well, I would find, first of all, that there's a gross lack of balance on both sides. That again, the New York Times and the Daily Telegraph is reproduced in religious terms, and you just see the same thing coming out, which I find very, very distressing. And I'm dealing with, well, I don't know if that's the right term, but I meet people, not many of them, who are rabid conservatives. Now, rabid, I mean the Pope should be expelled from the church. But that I find very distressing. And these people are good people, good religious practicing Catholics, and very intelligent people. But some of them are hopelessly partisan and not making that much effort to see the point of view of another person. They tend to say that, well, anyone who isn't violently opposed to abortion isn't a Catholic. Now, mind you, I wouldn't be far removed from that. For instance, I couldn't possibly vote for Democrats. I'd be that strong. But the others, at the same time, I don't condemn them, don't say the Pope should be expelled from the church, because he's going rather lightly on those. But the partisanship, that's developed, and it's the most distressing thing. Well, it's a distressing thing I find in modern life. Or if not, you've got to be very careful. Now, if I'm speaking to X, I must be very careful of what I say, and I must try to get the three topics on which we tend to agree discussed.
I'm going to go back. I think this might be the last thing I ask you, but I don't know if you've noticed again, another irony of today in the church is that the youth are particularly excited about tradition. And if you go to a traditional Latin Mass now, you'll actually see a lot of young people.
Yes, so I believe.
So
Someone told me that the other day for the first time.
So that's the first you had heard about that, is that right?
I'd never heard it put as strongly as this. This is a husband and wife whom I know quite well, but I hadn't been in touch. I'd been in touch with them, but I hadn't sat down with them for a good while. And I was down for dinner with them last Sunday, and they said all the children now go to one of these traditional masses, and the place is packed.
That's right. Yeah.
And not just in Ireland, but they said they have an experience of France and of England. That's very interesting.
It's big in America as well.
Is that so?
That's right, yeah. I don't know, I was going to ask you, did you have any thoughts on that? But yeah, I guess that this is news to you in the last
It's pretty
while.
well news to me.
Yeah.
I hadn't been aware of that, though I knew a number of adults who were very keen on the Latin Mass. And I had a bad experience with the Latin Mass myself. I was refused communion.
Why was that?
I went up to receive communion and I was told that isn't done here and I'll go away, more or less. And I went partially to hear the music, and there was no music that day.
So what are your memories? You're old enough to remember the traditional Mass before it turned into the new Mass. So what are your memories of that?
My memory of
and that change?
My memory of the change, first of all, I took it for granted that this would be always the way. And I went to Mass every Sunday, and I went to Mass at weekdays. And I remember after school, I often went down to the church and did the Stations of the Cross or something like that. And it was that type of practice. And my father, who had no intellectual interest in religion, but yet I often felt that the Holy Family was real to him as his own family, you know. And he used to take out a wallet at Mass where he had prayers from pamphlets and that neatly stuck in. And that was his religion. But it was a religion that worked for him and that he was devoted, an extremely good man. And I think a lot of the impetus for the change came from idealists who had no time for that type of spirituality. And yet it seems to me to have been reasonably fruitful. You may say, they went to Mass because they had to. Well, go to most people on Sunday going into Donnybrook Church. Well, they go in because they have to. So
you would say basically we haven't become any more sophisticated.
Oh no, I don't think
in our
so.
practice. Is that what you mean?
Oh yes, I don't think we are. And I think we are concentrating too much on governance. Governance is very important, but it's not the be-all and end-all of things. But I don't want to give a lecture on conservative Catholics, because I would be quite conservative myself. I remember enjoying your father, who's fairly conservative, wouldn't he?
He mightn't put it in those terms, but a lot of people would say that about him, that he seems to have those sensibilities, yeah. He wouldn't articulate it in that way, I don't think.
No, I don't think so.
But I think it might come out that way, yes. No, I might get into trouble for saying that, but
yeah.
You said it, not me.
Oh, yeah. I led you up the garden path into a pool. But he's a man for whom I've always great regard, I must say. But so I became very enthusiastic about the change when the novice master, my first year as a novice, we had the Easter Vigil, the first time I ever had it, and the new Easter Vigil, the new Easter ceremonies. I thought they were terrific. And we had Oh yes, we had the office of Holy Week. I thought that was great. And then gradually,
Someone myself.
oh, Father Rector, we must stand up. I didn't leap up. We had a very interesting discussion.
Or is this on film? Is
Yeah. But you were saying that the first Easter Vigil.
Oh yeah, that was a thrilling experience in the noviceship. And all the changes in that way won us over very easily. And even the ample vestments, they weren't allowed in Dublin in those days, but we had them in Emo. And certainly on that level I was very enthusiastic. I think we all were. And dialogue masses. But then I haven't been equally enthusiastic about other changes I've seen.
The experience of being headmaster, you've been headmaster in 2 schools, and you've a phenomenal memory for names and faces and people. So you've obviously enjoyed that a lot. And what do you think Jesuits can contribute to education?
Well, that's a broad question. I think it's what the individual Jesuit brings. My memory of school, good days and bad days, was determined greatly by individuals. And so I think that we bring to the school values like Joe Veale's values of liberal education. And I think possibly that we like the students. I think that's important. Someone said that about someone the other day. He said, he liked Father John Sullivan because he felt Father Sullivan liked him. I think that's an atmosphere in our schools, despite 1 or 2 stunning dissidents, that permeates school. There's a kindly atmosphere, and that people are respected. You might say, surely to God, every school is like that. If the teachers don't like the students won't like the teachers. And I think we've managed, by and large, to do well, by and large, to be emphasized.
Maybe it's time to call it a day.
Yeah.
Well, Father Barber, thank you again. That was really enjoyable.
Oh, I found it fascinating.
Thank you very much for your time.
Not at all. Delighted. Now, when I see what I've said, might be a different matter.